That night began like any other shift. It didn't end that way. The nurse never touched her. She didn't need to. She got within 3 feet of the gurney, drew a syringe of blood from the dying woman's arm, and seconds later, she was on the floor, convulsing, gasping for air she couldn't seem to find. Then the doctor went down, then another nurse. One by one, the strongest, most experienced trauma team in that hospital collapsed around a patient who never laid a hand on a single one of them, until the order came through to evacuate the entire emergency room, mid-shift, patients and all, into the parking lot outside. Nobody has ever fully explained what happened in that room. That's case 1 of 6 tonight. And it isn't even the strangest. From a woman burned to ash in a chair that never caught fire, to 5 men who vanished into the snow and turned up scattered, barefoot, in a state no examiner has ever been able to explain. 6 deaths, 6 investigations, run by real coroners, real fire marshals, real hospital pathologists, people whose entire careers are built on finding an answer. 6 case files that all end the exact same way. Not solved, not explained, not ever. Stay close tonight. If you're new here, welcome to the investigation. Subscribe and drop your check-in below, where you're listening from and what time it is when this case finds you. At 8:15 in the evening, on February 19th, 1994, paramedics wheeled a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez into the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital in California. She was semi-conscious, her breathing shallow, her heart racing in a fast, irregular rhythm that told the receiving staff immediately that this was a critical case. She had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer, and by every indication, her body was now failing under the weight of it. None of that, on its own, was unusual for an emergency room on a Saturday night. Terminally ill patients arrive in crisis constantly, and the staff at Riverside General had handled cases like hers more times than anyone could count. What happened over the next 45 minutes would become one of the strangest, most exhaustively investigated medical mysteries of the 20th century. And more than 30 years later, it remains, officially, unsolved. The emergency team began standard resuscitation efforts. An IV was started. Medications were administered to stabilize her heart rhythm and sedate her enough to allow treatment. Familiar drugs, standard doses, nothing outside routine practice. Her condition continued to decline regardless, and the team decided to attempt defibrillation. It was while preparing her for that procedure, removing her shirt to place the paddles, that staff first noticed something genuinely strange. Her skin carried an unusual oily sheen and a faint, unfamiliar odor. Fruity, tinged with something like garlic, seemed to be coming from her mouth. Nobody thought much of it in the moment. Dying patients present strange symptoms constantly, and the team's focus remained entirely on trying to save her life. A nurse drew a blood sample from her arm, and it was this single, routine action, performed thousands of times a day in emergency rooms across the country, that set off everything that followed. The blood in the syringe smelled distinctly of ammonia, and floating within it, visible against the light, were small, pale, manila-colored crystalline particles, something no one in that room had ever seen in a blood sample before. A medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, who had leaned in closely to examine the syringe, was the first to go down. She fainted almost immediately, collapsing to the floor of the treatment room. Within moments, a nurse who had been standing nearby collapsed as well. Then a respiratory therapist. Each one had been in relatively close proximity to Ramirez or her blood sample, and each described, in the moments before losing consciousness, a wave of nausea, muscle spasms, and a sudden inability to catch their breath. What had, seconds earlier, been a fairly ordinary, if urgent, resuscitation effort turned, almost instantly, into chaos. As staff members continued falling ill one after another, the hospital made the decision to evacuate the entire emergency department. Patients already being treated for unrelated conditions were wheeled out into the parking lot, mid-treatment, while a skeleton crew in hazmat suits remained behind to continue stabilizing Ramirez, who was, by this point, only minutes from death. She was declared dead at 8:50 that evening, roughly 35 minutes after she'd first arrived, from cardiac dysrhythmia, doctors would later determine, ultimately triggered by kidney failure related to her cancer. But her death didn't end the emergency. In total, 23 people who had been in the emergency room that night reported becoming ill, with symptoms ranging from lightheadedness and nausea to muscle spasms and genuine respiratory distress. 5 of them required hospitalization. One nurse, a respiratory therapist, spent 2 weeks in intensive care. Julie Gorczynski, the resident who had been closest to the blood sample when the first collapses began, went on to suffer long-term health complications afterward, including a bone condition in both knees that eventually required multiple surgeries, a consequence she and her physicians would later argue was connected to whatever she'd been exposed to that night. Ramirez's body was, in the aftermath, treated as though it might still pose an active hazard. It was sealed in a specially designed, hermetically sealed metal casket rather than a conventional one. When her autopsy was finally performed a week later, the physicians and technicians involved wore full hazmat protective suits throughout the entire procedure, an almost unheard of precaution for a routine post-mortem examination, and a clear signal of just how seriously the possibility of ongoing toxic contamination was being taken by professionals who don't typically overreact to uncertainty. What followed was one of the largest and most rigorous forensic investigations ever conducted into a single medical incident. California's Department of Health Services assigned 2 research scientists, Dr. Ana Maria Osorio and Dr. Kirsten Waller, to the case specifically, tasked with interviewing every staff member and patient present that night and attempting to reconstruct exactly what had happened, chemically, in that room. Investigators from Riverside County, alongside outside consultants brought in from national research laboratories, spent months testing samples, reviewing records, and attempting to identify any substance that could account for both Ramirez's own symptoms and the sudden, simultaneous collapse of over 20 separate hospital staff members. The official autopsy findings did offer some pieces of the puzzle, though never a complete picture. Toxicology confirmed the presence of several expected medications in her system, over-the-counter painkillers, a prescribed anti-nausea medication, and lidocaine, administered as part of her emergency treatment. The anti-nausea medication, in particular, is known to break down into compounds with an ammonia-like odor under certain conditions, which may have partially explained the smell noted during her treatment. But the autopsy also revealed something far less easily explained: an unusually high concentration of a compound called dimethylsulfone in her system, a chemical not typically found in significant quantities in a person's blood at all. One theory, developed by researchers at a national laboratory and published in a scientific journal several years after the incident, proposed a specific chain of events. Ramirez, it was suggested, had been using a substance called DMSO, dimethyl sulfoxide, a solvent occasionally used, including at the time, by people seeking pain relief, despite the FDA having restricted its approved medical uses, as a home remedy for her cancer-related pain. According to this theory, DMSO in her system had gradually converted into dimethylsulfone, the very compound found in unusually high concentrations during her autopsy, itself a relatively harmless substance on its own. But the theory proposed a further, more dramatic step, that during the emergency resuscitation, as oxygen was administered and her blood was drawn and agitated, the dimethylsulfone could have rapidly converted once more, this time into dimethyl sulfate, a genuinely toxic gas capable of causing exactly the kind of respiratory distress, nausea, and collapse reported by the staff that night. It's an elegant theory, and it remains, to this day, the most widely cited explanation for what happened in that emergency room. It has never been proven. No dimethyl sulfate was ever actually detected in any sample taken that night. The theory rests on a hypothetical chemical conversion that researchers believed was possible under the specific conditions present, not one they were able to demonstrate had definitely occurred. It was, in the words of the researchers who proposed it, one plausible explanation among several, never confirmed as fact, and openly acknowledged as unproven, even by the scientists who developed it. An entirely different explanation was floated by the county's own health investigators: mass psychogenic illness, more commonly known as mass hysteria, a real, well-documented phenomenon in which extreme stress and the visible collapse of one person in a group can trigger genuine, involuntary physical symptoms in others nearby, without any toxic substance being involved at all. It's not a dismissive diagnosis, and it isn't an accusation of anyone faking anything. The symptoms experienced under mass psychogenic illness are entirely real and involuntary, but it was a deeply unsatisfying explanation for many of the staff who had been there that night, several of whom firmly rejected it, pointing to the crystals visibly present in the blood sample and to Gorczynski's long-term physical complications as evidence that something chemically real had happened to them, not merely something psychological. Ramirez's own family, for their part, rejected both explanations entirely. They maintained, in the years following her death, that the entire Toxic Lady narrative had overshadowed who she actually was: a wife, a mother of 2 children, a woman already suffering the final stages of a brutal illness, and that the media's fixation on the bizarre circumstances of her death had stripped her of basic dignity in her final, most vulnerable moment. Some family members went further, suggesting the entire episode may have been mishandled or even covered up by the hospital in some way, though no evidence has ever substantiated that specific claim, and it remains, like every other explanation in this case, unproven. More than 30 years later, no single account has ever been definitively confirmed. Not the DMSO to dimethyl sulfate theory, not mass psychogenic illness, not any of the dozen smaller theories proposed by researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators in the decades since. Contaminated equipment, a reaction between multiple medications, an entirely separate environmental factor never identified at all. The case remains open in the sense that matters most. Nobody has ever been able to say, with real scientific confidence, exactly what happened inside that emergency room to that patient and to the 23 people who came near her. Dan Cupido, the chief deputy coroner for Riverside County at the time, put it about as plainly as anyone connected to the case ever has. They were, in his words, dealing with the unknown, and, every bit as much, with the fear of it. Decades of research, an enormous investigative effort, and one of the most detailed toxicology examinations conducted on any single case up to that point, have still not closed the distance between those two things. The investigation itself became almost as unusual as the incident it was trying to explain. Investigators didn't simply interview the staff who had collapsed. They mapped, in painstaking detail, exactly where every single person in that emergency room had been standing at the moment the first collapse occurred. Distance from the gurney, distance from the syringe, whether they'd been facing Ramirez directly or had their back turned, whether they'd been breathing through their mouth or nose. It's the kind of granular reconstruction usually reserved for airline disasters or industrial accidents, not a single patient's emergency treatment, and it reflects just how seriously investigators treated the possibility that whatever happened that night could happen again in some other hospital without warning, unless the exact mechanism could be identified and understood. Samples of Ramirez's blood, tissue, and the ambient air from the treatment room were sent to multiple independent laboratories for analysis, including at least one national research facility with expertise in chemical detection, brought in specifically because early theories included the possibility of some kind of industrial or even deliberately introduced toxin. That theory was eventually set aside for lack of any supporting evidence, but its consideration alone signals how far outside the range of ordinary hospital incidents this case was treated from the very beginning. Nothing about a standard cardiac arrest, however tragic, typically draws attention from specialists in chemical exposure. Even setting aside the competing scientific theories, the case exposed a genuine problem that extended well past Gloria Ramirez herself. The total lack of established protocol, at the time, for handling a mass casualty event triggered by an unknown substance emanating from a single patient. Riverside General's own emergency evacuation that night was improvised in real time. There was no existing playbook for clearing an entire emergency department mid-treatment because of a suspected but entirely unidentified contaminant. In the years following the incident, several hospitals across the country reportedly reviewed their own hazardous exposure protocols, specifically citing the Ramirez case as the reason, an unusual example of a single, unresolved medical mystery directly reshaping emergency procedure nationwide, regardless of whether the underlying cause was ever actually determined. That's perhaps the strangest part of the entire case. When it's considered as a whole, an event can go fully unexplained, mechanically, and still permanently change how professionals in an entire field behave afterward, treated less like a solved problem and more like a risk that simply has to be accounted for indefinitely without ever being fully understood. The case also left a lasting mark on the people who lived through it. in ways that extended well beyond any single medical journal article. Julie Gorczynski, the young medical resident who had been closest to the syringe when the first collapses began, spent years afterward dealing with the physical aftermath. The bone deterioration in both her knees eventually required multiple surgical procedures, and she would later say publicly that she felt her own long-term health had never been taken as seriously by researchers as the broader scientific puzzle surrounding what caused it. Other staff members who had been hospitalized that night described lingering respiratory sensitivity for years afterward, though none of it could ever be conclusively tied back to a specific chemical exposure, since no specific chemical was ever conclusively found. For the hospital itself, the incident became something the institution was never quite able to move past publicly, even as day-to-day operations resumed within days. Riverside General fielded interview requests from national and international media for years afterward, and the case was eventually picked up and re-examined by medical journals, television documentaries, and true crime and mystery programs alike, each one adding its own layer of speculation to a case that already had more theories than answers. What makes the Gloria Ramirez case different from a simple, unexplained death is that it never had the luxury of staying private or staying small. 23 other people were pulled into it, involuntarily, simply by being present and doing their jobs. Their names, for the most part, never became part of the public record the way Ramirez's did. She became the Toxic Lady, a nickname that would follow the case forever, while most of the people who actually fell ill that night went back to ordinary lives, carrying whatever lingering effects they had, largely out of the spotlight entirely. In the decades since, researchers outside the original investigation have periodically revisited the case with newer analytical tools, hoping advances in toxicology or chemical detection might finally settle the question definitively. None of these later efforts have produced conclusive new findings, largely because so much of the physical evidence, the original blood samples, the ambient air readings taken that night, either degraded over time or was only ever preserved in limited quantities to begin with. Each new generation of interest in the case tends to arrive at the same conclusion the original investigators did: several plausible explanations, none of them provable, and a genuine scientific dead end that no amount of renewed attention has been able to break through. That combination, real documented illness in more than 20 people, a substantial and genuinely rigorous investigation, and still no confirmed cause after more than 3 decades, is precisely what separates this case from ordinary medical misfortune. It isn't simply that something bad happened to a dying woman on an unlucky night. It's that professionals with every available resource still can't agree, more than 30 years later, on what that something actually was. Cases like it are rare enough that most emergency physicians will go their entire careers without ever encountering anything close to it. That rarity is, in its own way, part of what makes it so difficult to resolve. A single, unrepeated event, however well documented in the moment, doesn't offer researchers the thing science generally depends on most: the ability to observe the same phenomenon happen again, under controlled conditions, until a clear cause finally emerges. Gloria Ramirez's case happened exactly once, to exactly one patient, in exactly one room, and by the time anyone realized how significant it might become, the original moment was already over, preserved only in blood samples, testimony, and memory. If Gloria Ramirez's case leaves us with the unsettling image of a hospital room turning hazardous in an instant, with no cause anyone has ever proven, the next case turns that same uncertainty inward into a single, ordinary apartment where a woman was found reduced almost entirely to ash in a room that the fire investigators on scene insisted again and again simply should not have been possible to leave so untouched. At roughly 8 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1951, a landlady named Pansy Carpenter climbed the steps to a ground-floor apartment on Cherry Street in St. Petersburg, Florida, carrying a telegram for her tenant. The tenant, a 67-year-old widow named Mary Hardy Reeser, had moved to Florida from Pennsylvania after her husband's death, settling into the small, modern apartment in the city's exclusive northeast section, not far from where her son, a respected local physician, lived with his own family. Carpenter knocked. When no one answered, she reached for the door handle and found it warm to the touch, uncomfortably warm, in a way that made her hesitate before pushing it open. What she found inside would become one of the most exhaustively investigated and most enduringly unresolved deaths of the entire 20th century. The small apartment was largely intact. The furniture in most of the rooms stood exactly where it always had, but in one corner, where Reese's favorite overstuffed easy chair had been, there was almost nothing left at all. A pile of fine grey ash, a portion of blackened springs, and, extending out from the wreckage, a single human leg, still wearing its slipper, burned only from the knee down. Nearby, a small end table and a lamp had also been destroyed by fire. The ceiling above the chair had been darkened by smoke and heat, and that, remarkably, was nearly the full extent of the visible damage. The rest of the apartment, the curtains, the other furniture, a stack of newspapers sitting just a few feet away, remained essentially untouched. Of Mary Reeser herself, almost nothing recognizable remained. Her skull was found among the ashes, reduced and shrunken to roughly the size of a teacup, along with a small fragment of spine. 6 small objects, believed to be her teeth, were recovered from the debris. There was no torso to speak of, no arms, no facial structure of any kind, only ash, fine enough that investigators later described it as resembling the aftermath of a controlled cremation rather than an accidental house fire. The scene made no physical sense to the investigators called to examine it. Cremating a human body through fire alone typically requires sustained temperatures well above 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit for several continuous hours. Heat that, in any ordinary house fire, would have consumed the entire room, very likely the entire building, long before achieving anything close to what had happened to Mary Reeser's body specifically. And yet the newspapers a few feet away hadn't so much as yellowed. The room's few plastic light switches had partially melted from heat, and a small mantel clock nearby had stopped, apparently from the heat, at 4:20. But beyond that narrow radius, the fire seemed to have had almost no appetite at all. Firefighters and police who walked through the apartment that first morning described a strange, almost contradictory sensation. The acrid, unmistakable smell of a serious fire hanging in the air, paired with a room that, visually, looked as though nothing more than a small trash fire had briefly flared up and gone out on its own. Investigators pieced together Reeser's final hours as best they could from those who'd seen her the previous evening. She had reportedly been upset over an unrelated family matter earlier that day. Her son had stopped by briefly around 8 o'clock that evening to check on her. Later, she spoke with her landlady, mentioning that she'd already taken 2 sleeping tablets and was considering taking 2 more before bed. She was last known to be wearing a rayon nightgown and a pair of black satin slippers, and was in the habit of smoking a cigarette while sitting in that same easy chair before turning in for the night. A telegram had arrived for her the following morning from a friend up north confirming travel plans for a trip Risa had apparently been planning to take. The very telegram Pansy Carpenter had been carrying up the walkway when she first noticed the door was warm. Risa never got the chance to read it. Word of the case spread quickly, and so did public theories, many of them wildly disconnected from anything resembling forensic possibility. One tip that reached St. Petersburg, police claimed a witness had seen a ball of fire come through Risa's open window and strike her directly. Another insisted she had been murdered elsewhere, her body cremated off-site by the killer, and the remains deliberately returned to the apartment afterward to stage the scene. A third suggested she had been struck by an unexplained natural phenomenon similar to ball lightning, a genuine but extremely rare atmospheric event that some witnesses of unrelated incidents have described in broadly similar terms over the decades. None of these theories held up to any scrutiny, but their sheer volume and the seriousness with which local police apparently felt obligated to log and consider each one reflected just how thoroughly the case had captured public imagination in the weeks following her death. A genuine national story, not a small-town curiosity, syndicated in newspapers well beyond Florida within days of the discovery. Stalled and increasingly uncertain of their own conclusions, St. Petersburg's police chief, J.R. Reichert, made an unusual decision for a local department investigating what was, on paper, a single, accidental house fire. He shipped a box of physical evidence directly to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., for independent analysis. The submitted materials included fragments of glass recovered from the ashes, the 6 small objects believed to be teeth, pieces of melted metal found near the body, fibers recovered from what remained of Risa's nightgown, bone fragments, chair stuffing, charred wood, a section of the room's rug that had been heavily soaked with a greasy substance, the surviving shoe, and the springs from the destroyed chair. The FBI's analysis, delivered back to St. Petersburg roughly a month later, concluded that the greasy substance soaked into the rug was, in fact, human fat, rendered from Risa's own body during the fire. Their working theory, since widely referred to by fire investigators as the wick effect, proposed that Risa had most likely fallen asleep in her chair with a lit cigarette, which ignited her highly flammable rayon nightgown, rather than the fire spreading outward the way an ordinary house fire would. Her body itself became something closer to a candle, clothing, and eventually skin acting as a wick, with the body's own rendered fat serving as slow-burning fuel, sustaining a contained, intensely hot flame localized almost entirely to her body and the immediate chair, rather than radiating outward the way typical structural fires do. Crucially, the report also stated there was no evidence of any accelerant, no gasoline, no chemical agent, nothing external that might have been deliberately used to help produce a fire of that intensity. The evidence had been shipped to Washington on July 7th, 5 days after Reese's body was discovered. A delay that itself reflected just how uncertain local investigators were about how to even begin approaching a scene like this one. It's worth understanding just how unusual the wick effect actually is as a physical event, even among fire investigators who broadly accept it as real. It requires a fairly specific set of conditions to occur at all. A body with enough retained fat to sustain prolonged burning, a source of external ignition first, clothing absorbent enough to wick melted fat, the way a candle's wick draws liquid wax upward into a flame, and, critically, enough time passing undisturbed for that slow, self-contained burn to run its full course, without anyone noticing or interrupting it. Risa lived alone, her nearest neighbor separated by enough distance and thick enough walls that the ordinary sounds and smells of the fire apparently never registered as an emergency to anyone until the following morning. The report was, notably, explicit on one further point. The investigators found absolutely no evidence from any of the cases on record to show that burning of this nature occurs other than when the body is ignited by some external means. A direct rejection, at least in the FBI's own language, of spontaneous human combustion as a real, independent phenomenon distinct from an ordinary ignition source acting on a body under unusual conditions. St. Petersburg police closed their investigation shortly after receiving that analysis, officially ruling Risa's death an accident. A smoldering cigarette, a flammable nightgown, and a slow, self-sustaining fire that consumed her almost entirely before anyone had any reason to notice. Not everyone involved in the case accepted that conclusion quite so cleanly. Chief Reichert had also brought in an outside specialist during the investigation, Wilton M. Krogman, a physical anthropologist with a strong national reputation in forensic examination of burned and skeletal remains, whose prior work included identifying victims from cremated and severely burned remains in criminal cases across the country. Krogman's own notes on the case have since been lost, but multiple accounts describe him as initially skeptical of the accidental explanation, troubled specifically by how completely Risa's body had been reduced, compared to how little the room around her had actually burned. In his professional experience, bodies subjected to house fires, even fatal ones, rarely burned past significant charring of the torso and limbs. Full reduction to ash, including the near-total loss of a skull down to a fraction of its original size, was something he associated far more with deliberate, sustained crematorium conditions than with an accidental ignition in an ordinary living room. He reportedly softened that skepticism somewhat in later years, though he never fully abandoned his sense that something about the case remained genuinely difficult to reconcile with ordinary fire behavior. A columnist who revisited the case decades later would ultimately side with the FBI's account as the most credible, if incomplete, explanation available, a phrasing that captures, about as well as anything else written about this case, exactly how unsatisfying even the leading theory remains for many who examine it closely. The wick effect itself, while widely accepted today among fire investigators as the most scientifically plausible explanation for cases like Risa's, has always remained a hypothesis rather than a fully reproduced certainty. It has since been tested, including in at least one later British case investigation, where researchers wrapped a sample of animal fat in cloth to simulate clothing and demonstrated that a contained, candle-like burn really could sustain itself for an extended period, using rendered fat as fuel, lending real scientific weight to the theory without ever fully replicating the specific, extreme totality of destruction seen in Risa's case. Risa was buried afterward in Pennsylvania, near family, in the same quiet, unresolved manner in which so much of her case has always existed. A file marked closed by the department that investigated it, while remaining, in every meaningful sense, still genuinely unsolved. There were no suspects, because nothing about the case ever definitively pointed toward a crime. There was no clear mechanism fully proven, because Wick effect describes a plausible physical process, not a confirmed, witnessed sequence of events. And no one, not the FBI, not Krogman, not any investigator since, ever actually watched a body burn this way, under controlled conditions, closely enough to call it settled. Beyond reasonable doubt, what there is, 70 years later, is a single question that has outlived every official conclusion offered so far. How does a body burn to that degree, in that short a time, in a room that otherwise looks like nothing happened at all? It's a case that has been picked up again and again in the decades since, by journalists, by paranormal investigators, by fire science researchers genuinely trying to understand the physical limits of the Wick effect, and by descendants of Risa's own family, some of whom have spoken publicly, often decades later, and often reluctantly, about what it's like to grow up as a living connection to one of the most famous unsolved deaths in American history. One of Risa's granddaughters, who had been among the last relatives to see her alive during a family visit the day before her death, later gave interviews decades afterward, describing what it was like to carry that connection privately for most of her life, approached, occasionally, by strangers who recognized the family name from books and articles about the case, long before she ever chose to speak publicly about it herself. The press coverage at the time was extensive and often strikingly specific for a 1951 Wire story. Newspapers described Risa's remains as having disintegrated, a word funeral directors involved in handling her case reportedly pushed back on directly, noting that the sheer intensity of heat required to produce that result should have, by any conventional standard, left far more damage to the apartment than investigators actually found. Risa herself was given a nickname by the press almost immediately, the Cinder Lady, a label that stuck to the case for decades afterward, appearing in headlines and retrospectives long after most of the original investigators involved had died. The case's significance extends well beyond Risa herself, in part because of how unusually well documented it is compared to similar incidents. Most reported cases resembling spontaneous combustion, before and since, exist mainly as local news items or second-hand folklore, thin on verifiable detail and impossible to properly investigate after the fact. Risa's case is different specifically because a full federal forensic laboratory took the physical evidence seriously enough to analyze it directly, and because that analysis, along with much of the surrounding correspondence, still exists and remains publicly available today. That's a rare thing in this entire category of case. Genuine federal-level forensic documentation applied to a death this strange, rather than only speculation built after the fact. That documentation has since shaped how fire investigators approach similar scenes decades later. Modern arson and fire death investigators, studying unusually contained burn patterns, still reference the Risa case directly. using it as a baseline example of what a genuine wick effect fire can look like when it runs uninterrupted. Precisely because so few other cases in the historical record come with a comparable paper trail, later incidents bearing a similar signature in the decades since have often been evaluated specifically against the Risa file, testing whether their own evidence matches the pattern the FBI first documented in 1951: minimal accelerant, extreme localized destruction, and a fire that behaves almost nothing like an ordinary structural blaze. And yet, even with that unusually rigorous documentation, the case still hasn't produced full consensus. Skeptics of the accidental explanation continue to point to the same core inconsistency that troubled investigators from the very first morning: the physical mismatch between how completely a body burned and how little the room around it seemed to notice. Believers in the wick effect point out, in turn, that the theory has been partially replicated under laboratory conditions since, and that human fat genuinely can sustain a slow, self-contained flame for an extended period once ignited, meaning the physics, at minimum, are not impossible, even if no one has ever fully reproduced the totality of destruction seen in Risa's specific case. Fire researchers estimate that genuinely documented cases fitting this exact pattern, near total destruction of a body alongside minimal damage to the surrounding structure, number only in the low hundreds across recorded history worldwide, making it one of the rarer categories of death a fire investigator might ever personally encounter, let alone one with as complete an evidentiary record as Risa's. Officially, science has an answer for what happened to Mary Risa. Unofficially, it's an answer that still leaves nearly everyone who examines the case with the same lingering, unresolved feeling. Technically explained, and yet somehow still not really understood at all. If Mary Risa's case leaves us with a single body burned far beyond anything the surrounding room could account for, the next case pushes that same impossible imbalance even further. Not into a private apartment where only one person witnessed the aftermath, but onto a public street where a fire commander himself would later describe watching flames rise directly out of a living man's body, with no visible source at all. A little after 5 o'clock in the morning on September 13th, 1967, a small group of office workers stood at a bus stop in Lambeth, South London, waiting for the first bus of the day. It was still dark, the street quiet in the particular way London streets are quiet just before a workday properly begins. A handful of commuters, half awake, checking watches, saying little to each other. One of the women noticed a flickering blue light coming from an upper window of a derelict house across the road at number 49 Auckland Street, a property that had sat empty for some time, well known to locals as one of several abandoned council houses scattered through that particular stretch of the neighborhood. She assumed, reasonably enough, that it was a gas leak that had somehow ignited, nothing more alarming than that, in a city full of old buildings and older plumbing, where minor gas-related incidents in aging housing stock weren't especially unusual. She called the fire brigade anyway, just to be safe, giving the address as best she could from across the street. What the responding crew found instead would go on to become one of the most frequently cited and most difficult to dismiss cases in the entire history of alleged spontaneous human combustion. At 5:24 that morning, Lambeth Fire Brigade arrived at the scene under Station Officer Jack Stacey, The building itself was a council-owned property, long since abandoned, disconnected entirely from both gas and electricity, a detail that would matter enormously once investigators began trying to explain what they were about to find, since it immediately ruled out the ordinary, mundane explanation the woman at the bus stop had assumed in the first place. There was no gas supply in that building. There couldn't have been a gas leak, because there was no gas. Stacy was first through an upper window, climbing a ladder brought up by his crew. What he found inside, at the bottom of a staircase leading to the second floor, was the burning body of a man named Robert Francis Bailey, a local homeless man known to residents in the area, and known, specifically, as someone who struggled with alcoholism, often drinking whatever he could find, including on occasion methylated spirits, a cheap and highly toxic industrial alcohol sometimes consumed by desperate alcoholics, despite its serious health risks. Bailey had apparently sought shelter in the empty house overnight, as he reportedly had on previous occasions. Stacy's own account of the scene, given afterward and repeated in nearly every serious examination of the case since, described something almost impossible to reconcile with an ordinary fire. Bailey was lying partly on his left side, his knees drawn up toward his stomach, in a position Stacy later described as looking as though the man had been trying to physically bend himself around some unbearable internal pain. And there, in Bailey's abdomen, was a 4-inch slit, an open wound in his stomach, from which a blue flame was issuing outward, under real pressure, like a blowtorch, in Stacy's own words. The flame wasn't simply flickering off burning clothing or skin. It was being forced outward from inside his body, with enough sustained force that it had already begun to scorch the wooden stairs beneath him. Firefighters, initially still hoping Bailey might somehow be alive and salvageable, used extinguishers in an attempt to put out the flame directly. It made no meaningful difference at first. The fire, by every account from the scene, appeared to be burning from a source located inside Bailey's own body, not simply on its surface, and extinguishing an external fire does very little to stop combustion that's occurring beneath the skin, assuming that's genuinely what was happening. Firefighters ultimately had to direct a hose nozzle essentially into the slit in Bailey's abdomen itself in order to fully extinguish the flame. By the time the fire was out, Bailey was dead, and the physical evidence left behind at the scene was, in its own way, just as strange as the flame itself had been. Bailey's clothing was found largely intact everywhere except around the abdomen, where the fire had clearly originated and done its damage, an unusual pattern for any fire that supposedly started externally, since flames spreading from outside a body onto clothing typically consumes fabric in a much more scattered, chaotic way than the tightly localized damage found on Bailey. The floor and stairs immediately beneath his body had scorched, exactly where the flame had been directed, but the rest of the derelict house remained essentially untouched. No smoke damage spreading through the structure, no fire climbing the walls or consuming nearby wood the way an uncontained house fire normally would, even in a building that had already sat empty and decaying for years. Perhaps the single most unsettling detail recovered from the scene was this. Bailey's teeth were found clamped down with such force onto the solid mahogany newel post at the base of the staircase that fire crews had to physically pry his jaw open in order to remove his body from the scene. It strongly suggested he had been alive and fully conscious for at least some portion of whatever happened to him, biting down hard enough to leave real, lasting damage to solid hardwood, almost certainly in direct response to overwhelming physical pain, rather than dying instantly and painlessly the way a sudden external ignition might be expected to happen. The case immediately drew significant press attention, in part because of how directly it seemed to contradict the leading scientific explanation already established for similar cases by that point, the same wick effect theory the FBI had used to explain Mary Reese's death 16 years earlier. The wick effect, as a mechanism, depends on an external ignition source first, typically a dropped cigarette or open flame, igniting a person's clothing, which then slowly consumes the body's own rendered fat as fuel over an extended period, producing a contained, localized burn that behaves, physically, something like an inverted candle, clothing acting as wick, liquefied fat acting as fuel, drawn upward and consumed gradually, from the outside of the body inward. It's a theory built specifically around fire, consuming a body gradually from the outside in, over a period of hours, typically while the victim is unconscious or already deceased, and therefore unable to react to what's happening. Bailey's case appeared to describe something closer to the opposite. Rather than a slow-burning candle consuming him gradually from without, witnesses described a flame apparently originating from inside his body and forcing its way outward through an open wound in his abdomen, under enough pressure to act, in Stacy's own description, like a blowtorch rather than a slow-burning candle, a combustion source with actual force and directionality behind it, not simply flame licking upward off saturated clothing the way a wick effect would predict. And critically, Bailey was alive and conscious for at least part of the event, biting down hard enough on solid mahogany to leave lasting damage, which the wick effect, built around a victim already unconscious or deceased before serious burning begins, doesn't easily account for either. Investigators and skeptics who examined the case in the years since have proposed several possible mundane explanations, none of which has ever been fully proven to everyone's satisfaction. One theory centers on Bailey's alcoholism specifically. Heavy, sustained alcohol consumption is known to produce elevated levels of certain gases within the digestive system, and some researchers have proposed that a buildup of internally generated gas, ignited by an external source, most plausibly a dropped cigarette, given Bailey's likely smoking habits as a rough sleeper, combined with the loose newspaper and debris typically found scattered through long-abandoned buildings of that kind, could potentially escape through some existing wound or tear in the abdomen and burn outward under real pressure for a period, mimicking the blowtorch effect firefighters described. This remains a theory rather than a demonstrated mechanism. No controlled study has ever successfully reproduced a sustained blowtorch-like flame issuing from a living human abdomen under comparable conditions, and the theory requires several separate, unlikely factors: an existing wound, ignitable internal gas at sufficient pressure, and a specific ignition point to have all aligned simultaneously. Committed skeptics of spontaneous human combustion as a genuine, distinct phenomenon, including several well-known professional investigators of paranormal claims who have examined this case specifically over the decades, have generally maintained that some combination of alcohol-related internal gas buildup and an external ignition source remains the most scientifically plausible explanation available, even without a fully reconstructed mechanism, arguing that an unproven mundane explanation is still more likely than an entirely unprecedented biological event. Others, including at least one prominent television investigation that revisited the case decades later using modern fire science, have pointed to the specific, forceful, sustained nature of the flame, behaving less like an escaping gas pocket briefly igniting, and more like continuous internal combustion, as something that still doesn't fit cleanly into any fully mundane explanation offered so far. What isn't disputed by anyone who has examined the case seriously is Stacy's own account of what he personally witnessed that morning. A professional, experienced fire officer, not a random passerby prone to exaggeration, describing in plain, specific, physically detailed language something he encountered directly, at close range, while actively working to save a man's life. He was not a witness recounting something from a distance, or relying on second-hand information. He climbed through that window himself, saw the wound, saw the flame, and personally directed the effort to extinguish it. Very little was ever recorded about Robert Bailey's life beyond his final circumstances. He was known locally as a rough sleeper, someone who moved between derelict buildings and temporary shelter, depending on the season and his own circumstances, and someone whose struggles with alcohol were, by every account, well known to people in the immediate area, even if his broader personal history, where he'd come from, whether he had any surviving family, what his life had looked like before homelessness and addiction defined it, was never widely documented at all. That absence of personal detail stands in sharp contrast to how thoroughly his death has been documented and re-examined ever since. Bailey himself remains, in a real sense, almost as unknown to history as his final moments are well known, a man whose actual life left barely a trace in the historical record, while the 4 minutes his fire commander spent trying to save him have been analyzed, quoted, and debated in books, documentaries, and fire science journals for more than 50 years. The case has since been revisited by multiple generations of paranormal investigators, fire scientists, and skeptics, each bringing their own era's forensic tools and assumptions to the same limited set of facts. In the 1970s and 1980s, the case became a fixture in popular books cataloging supposed spontaneous combustion incidents, presented largely at face value, alongside other well-known British cases from the same general period and region, accounts that, taken together, helped cement the idea in the public imagination that something genuinely unexplained might be happening to a small number of people, disproportionately elderly, isolated, or heavy drinkers, found burned in their own homes with minimal surrounding damage. Later investigators, working with a more explicitly skeptical lens and improved understanding of fire behavior, pushed back hard against that framing, arguing that each case in that catalogue, examined individually and rigorously, tends to reveal at least one plausible mundane explanation involving alcohol, smoking, and the specific physics of how fat and clothing burn, even when, as in Bailey's case, that explanation still requires several separate assumptions stacked on top of each other to fully account for everything witnesses actually described. Television investigators in the 2000s and 2010s revisited the case using modern fire modeling and thermal imaging in an attempt to reconstruct, at least theoretically, how a contained internal flame of that intensity might have developed and sustained itself. Those reconstructions have generally supported the broad plausibility of an internally generated gas ignition without ever fully replicating the specific, sustained, forceful blowtorch-like flame Stacy described firsthand. That gap between theoretically possible under some circumstances and actually demonstrated to happen this way is precisely where the Bailey case has remained, largely unmoved, for more than half a century. That gap matters more here than in almost any other case in this category, precisely because of who was doing the describing. Fire investigators, by the nature of their profession, see an enormous number of bodies recovered from fires over the course of a career. Burns from every conceivable cause, at every conceivable stage, in every kind of structure. A description that specific, that confident, and that consistent across the decades since. Coming from someone with that much direct professional exposure to ordinary fire behavior carries a different kind of weight than a similar account from someone without that frame of reference. Stacy wasn't guessing at what he'd seen, or reaching for a dramatic way to describe an ordinary fire. He was describing, in the plainest terms available to him, something that simply didn't match anything else he'd encountered doing that job. The very idea of spontaneous human combustion long predates Bailey's death by more than a century, and understanding that history helps explain why his case landed with such force when it hit the press in 1967. Reports of people apparently burning to death with little external cause date back to at least the 18th century, showing up periodically in European medical literature and newspaper accounts, almost always involving isolated, elderly, or heavy drinking individuals found partially consumed by fire in rooms that showed comparatively little damage. The concept became famous enough in popular culture that Charles Dickens used it as the cause of a character's death in his novel Bleak House in 1853, drawing public criticism at the time from at least one prominent German chemist who argued forcefully that no such phenomenon could occur without violating basic principles of combustion, a criticism Dickens defended himself against directly, citing the medical case reports available to him at the time. That argument, in one form or another, has essentially continued for the century and a half since. A small number of witnessed, physically documented cases on one side, and a firm scientific insistence that spontaneous combustion, without any external ignition source at all, simply isn't physically possible on the other. What makes Bailey's case so difficult to fold neatly into either side of that argument is precisely the presence of a credible eyewitness with professional training. Most historical cases of alleged spontaneous combustion are reconstructed entirely after the fact, from a body already found dead, with no one present to describe what the fire itself actually looked like while it was still burning. Bailey's case is one of the rare exceptions. A trained fire officer, present at the scene while the flame was still actively producing, personally directing efforts to extinguish it, and describing specific, physically detailed characteristics of that flame that don't cleanly resemble an ordinary house fire, a wick effect burn, or, by his own account, anything else he'd encountered in his professional career. More than half a century later, Robert Bailey's case remains one of the most frequently cited examples in any serious discussion of unexplained human combustion, precisely because so much of what happened that morning was witnessed directly by trained professionals whose entire job depends on correctly identifying how fires start and behave. Professionals who, in this specific case, walked away from the scene without a fire behavior any of them could confidently explain, using anything from their own years of prior experience. If Mary Reese's death left investigators trying to explain how a body could burn so completely while its surroundings stayed largely untouched, Robert Bailey's case pushes that same unresolved question somewhere even stranger, inward, into the body itself, where the next case takes us as well, to a house in England more than a decade later, where almost nothing would be left of the man inside, except his skull, his lower legs, and a fine layer of human fat coating nearly every surface of the room around him. On the evening of Saturday, January 5th, 1980, in a small council house on the Rassaw estate in Ebbw Vale, South Wales, a 73-year-old former steelworks rigger named Henry Thomas settled into his armchair in front of the television, as he did most evenings. Records suggest he had spent much of his working life at the nearby Ebbw Vale Steelworks, one of the town's major employers for generations, before retiring into the quieter rhythm of life alone in a modest council house on the local Rassaw estate. He lived alone. Both doors leading into his living room were shut and sealed with draft excluder, a small but ordinary detail of daily life for an elderly man trying to keep a Welsh winter out of his home, a detail that would later become one of the most important and most genuinely strange pieces of evidence in the entire case, since it meant the room's air supply had been almost completely cut off from the rest of the house for the duration of whatever had happened inside it. A fire burning in a sealed, low-oxygen environment behaves very differently than one with an open flow of fresh air feeding it, and investigators would spend considerable time afterward trying to reconcile that detail with the sheer intensity of destruction found at the center of the room. That same evening, his next-door neighbor stepped into the back garden and noticed foul-smelling smoke drifting from Thomas's chimney. It wasn't an unusual sight in that neighborhood in January. Plenty of households burned rubbish or extra fuel on cold nights, and the neighbor thought nothing more of it, going back inside without a second thought. It would be the last ordinary thing anyone would ever think about that house. The following morning, Sunday, January 6th, police were called to the scene by a family member who had grown concerned after being unable to reach him. What they found inside would go on to become one of the most rigorously documented cases in the entire history of alleged spontaneous human combustion, not because of sensational retelling years later, but because of one detail almost no other case like it has: a trained crime scene officer present at the investigation from its earliest hours, taking detailed contemporaneous notes rather than relying on memory reconstructed after the fact, years or even decades after the event itself had already faded. In front of the armchair, officers found a heap of fine grey ash, a blackened skull, and the lower portions of both legs, still clothed in socks, with the trouser legs largely intact around them, and Thomas's feet themselves completely undamaged by the fire that had consumed almost everything above them. His slippers were found nearby on the carpet, just beyond his unburned feet, suggesting he had eased them off before settling in to watch television that evening, exactly as he likely did most nights of the week. Roughly half of the armchair itself had been destroyed by the fire, eventually collapsing enough that the remains dropped partially to the floor, and there, 12 to 15 feet away from where Thomas had been sitting, the family's television set sat with its plastic control knobs and front panel completely melted, while the screen itself, remarkably, was still lit, the set apparently still switched on, and drawing power, despite the intense heat that had reached it from across the room. On a table near the center of the room, a small display of plastic flowers had liquefied entirely, reduced to a puddle of melted plastic on the tabletop, and throughout the room, coating nearly every surface, window glass, light bulbs, furniture, investigators found a fine, greasy mist. Hamer would later describe the room as bathed in a strange orange glow, produced by daylight and the household's own electric lighting being filtered through this fine coating of evaporated human fat that had condensed across every surface in the room once the air began to cool. An image so specific and so unusual that it has been repeated, almost word for word, in nearly every subsequent retelling of the case since. The scenes of crime officer who processed the scene, Detective Sergeant John Hamer, documented what he found in language that has since been quoted in nearly every subsequent account of the case. The ashes lay on a rug and a foam-backed fitted carpet, both of which were only burned where they were in contact with the ashes. The charred portion of the rug and carpet were saturated in melted human fat. He would later note that beneath that fitted carpet, investigators discovered a layer of thermoplastic floor tiles, a material that melts at a comparatively low temperature, and that even those tiles had survived the incident completely intact, directly beneath a spot where a human body had been almost entirely reduced to ash. It was, for Hamer, one of the clearest physical demonstrations in the entire case of just how tightly confined and vertically limited the destructive heat had actually been, despite its severity. Beyond the ash, the destroyed half of the chair, the melted television knobs, and the liquefied plastic flowers, the rest of the room was left remarkably undisturbed. The carpet and the rug beneath the chair were burned only in the specific areas where they had been in direct contact with the ashes themselves, and where they were burned, investigators found them saturated with melted human fat, exactly as had been found beneath Mary Reese's chair 3 decades earlier, and beneath Robert Bailey 13 years before that. Beneath the fitted carpet, officers also discovered a layer of thermoplastic floor tiles that, despite everything happening directly above them, had remained completely unmelted and undamaged. Investigators noted there had been a small fire burning in Thomas's fireplace grate, within easy arm's reach of where his chair stood, and it offered what seemed, at first glance, like an obvious and mundane explanation. Perhaps a spark had jumped from the grate, or Thomas himself had somehow ignited while tending to it earlier that evening, before settling back down to watch television. But officers at the scene found no physical evidence connecting the fireplace itself to the fire that had consumed Thomas's body. No trail of scorching led from the grate to the chair. No fallen embers were found along any plausible path between the two. Whatever had happened, it did not appear to have started as an ordinary fireplace accident that had simply spread. One specific theory raised early in the investigation proposed that Thomas might have somehow set his own hair alight while leaning close to stoke the fire, then returned to his chair, unaware that he was burning, gradually succumbing without ever noticing or reacting to what was happening to him. Hamer, the trained officer who had processed the scene firsthand, argued directly against this explanation in his own notes, and later writing, "A man whose hair had genuinely caught fire," he reasoned, "would have felt it immediately and reacted, jumping up, patting at his head, calling out for help, doing virtually anything other than calmly sitting back down in an armchair and remaining still long enough to be almost entirely consumed by fire without any apparent struggle. Nothing about the physical scene, in Hamer's professional judgment, was consistent with a man who had realized he was on fire and made any attempt to respond to it. The official cause of death was ultimately recorded simply as death by burning, language that acknowledged how he died without ever fully explaining why the fire had behaved the way it so clearly had. Thomas had, by the medical examiner's own reasoning, very likely inhaled the products of his own combustion as it occurred, which would help explain why neighbors reported no cries, no sounds of distress, nothing audible enough through a shared wall to suggest anything was badly wrong, until the smoke was noticed the following evening. Hamer's own account, written from notes taken at the scene itself rather than reconstructed years later from memory, has since become the primary source. Nearly every subsequent examination of the Thomas case draws directly from a level of first-hand documentation genuinely uncommon in this entire category of case. He went on to spend much of the rest of his career specifically researching similar incidents, eventually publishing a full-length book on the subject, titled The Entrancing Flame, which drew together the Thomas case alongside dozens of other historical and contemporary incidents he had personally investigated or corresponded with other researchers about. In it, he argued that a distinct category of unexplained human combustion deserved serious, sustained scientific investigation in its own right, rather than being dismissed case by case as a series of unrelated, individually explainable accidents. Hamer's position carried particular weight within the field precisely because of his professional background. He wasn't a paranormal enthusiast approaching the subject from the outside, but a trained police investigator whose entire career had been built around distinguishing genuine physical evidence from speculation, and who maintained, based on that same professional training, that the Thomas case in particular resisted every conventional explanation he was able to test against it. The case has since taken on a life of its own within British popular culture surrounding unexplained phenomena, referenced repeatedly in books, television documentaries, and regional retrospectives on strange local history, particularly within Wales itself. For many people who grew up in or near Ebbw Vale in the years following 1980, the Thomas case became something closer to local folklore than distant tabloid sensation, a genuinely documented, geographically nearby event that lent an unusual sense of immediacy to a phenomenon most people only ever encounter as a strange headline from somewhere else entirely. Not everyone in the field has agreed with that conclusion, even while broadly respecting the quality of Hamer's original documentation. Joe Nickell, a longtime research fellow, focused specifically on debunking paranormal claims through conventional forensic explanation, has written extensively about the Thomas case as part of a broader pattern he identifies across nearly every alleged spontaneous combustion incident on record. In Nichols' analysis, the demographic profile recurs with striking consistency across case after case, decade after decade, country after country. An elderly, often impaired individual, intoxicated, sedated, unwell, or simply dozing, seated near a plausible ignition source, whose body then burns according to the wick effect once ignited, with rendered fat sustaining a slow, self-contained flame that explains both the totality of destruction to the body and the surprising lack of damage to the surrounding room. Nickel points to this same underlying pattern across dozens of comparable cases spanning nearly 3 centuries. Mary Reeser, sedated on sleeping tablets, smoking in her chair. An elderly widow found decades earlier in similarly total destruction, seated beside her own coal grate, alone, late at night. A young woman in the 1980s reported to have caught fire suddenly and dramatically in a stairwell, whose case Nickel attributes to an already smouldering ember in her clothing rather than any instantaneous ignition. Thomas himself, 73 years old and very possibly dozing in front of the television after settling into his chair for the evening, fits that same general pattern closely. In Nickel's view, an elderly man, an open fire within reach, and a slow, undetected ignition that went unnoticed until it had already run its course. Exactly as Nickel argues has happened, with only minor variation, in every well-documented case of this kind, going back to the very first formal written account of the phenomenon in the 17th century. Where the Thomas case complicates even that explanation, though, is in the specific pattern of damage recorded at the scene. The wick effect, as generally understood, depends on burning progressing outward from an ignition point across the body relatively evenly, consuming clothing and flesh together, as fat renders and is drawn upward through fabric, acting as a wick, typically over a period of several hours. But Thomas's trousers and socks were found essentially undamaged around his lower legs, while his upper body and head were almost completely destroyed, an asymmetry that doesn't fit as cleanly with a single, gradually spreading wick effect burn as it does with cases like Reese's, where destruction was more evenly total across the body. A genuine sustained wick effect fire, given enough time and fuel, would generally be expected to eventually work its way down a seated body toward the legs as well, particularly given how many hours must have passed for the upper body to be reduced so completely. Instead, the fire in Thomas's case appears to have concentrated overwhelmingly at the top of his body and simply stopped, cleanly, at roughly the knee, almost as if something about the fuel source itself had been exhausted at exactly that point, rather than the fire spreading naturally along the length of his legs, the way rendered fat, traveling through fabric, would normally be expected to behave. Some researchers have proposed that Thomas's fire may have begun specifically at the top of his body, potentially near his head or chest, perhaps ignited by a dropped cigarette or an ember from the nearby fireplace catching in his clothing or hair, and simply never migrated downward before it had fully consumed everything above the knee, leaving his lower legs, socks and trouser cuffs entirely untouched by comparison. Others have pointed to the specific physiology of an elderly, seated body as a possible partial explanation. Fat distribution in an aging body tends to concentrate more heavily around the torso than the lower legs, meaning a wick effect fire, however it started, may simply have had far less fuel available to sustain itself once it reached that point, causing it to burn out naturally rather than continue downward. Neither explanation has ever been conclusively tested against the specific conditions present in Thomas's living room that night, and both remain, like nearly everything else about this case, plausible without being proven. More than 4 decades later, the Henry Thomas case remains one of the most frequently cited examples in serious discussions of the phenomenon, precisely because of that rare combination, a scene documented in real time by a trained investigator, physical evidence preserved and cross-referenced against dozens of similar cases since, and a pattern of destruction that even committed skeptics acknowledge doesn't fold neatly into the leading conventional explanation without at least one additional unproven assumption layered on top of it. It occupies an unusual position in the broader catalogue of alleged spontaneous combustion cases, neither easily dismissed as folklore or misremembered accident, given the quality of Hamer's contemporaneous documentation, nor conclusively proven to represent anything beyond an unusually severe and unusually localized version of an already understood fire phenomenon. That tension, a case too well documented to dismiss, and too incomplete in its physical evidence to fully resolve, is, in its own way, the defining feature of nearly every case examined seriously in this category. Investigators rarely get to choose how much evidence survives a fire. In Thomas's case, they got more than almost anyone else ever has. A trained eyewitness account, written within hours, preserved physical evidence, and a clearly documented, specific, asymmetric pattern of destruction. And even with all of that, more than 40 years of subsequent analysis still hasn't produced a single explanation that every serious researcher who has examined the case is willing to fully accept. A genuine, working scene, studied by a professional, and still, after more than 4 decades of scrutiny by scientists on every side of the debate, not fully closed. If Henry Thomas's case leaves behind an image of ordinary domestic life interrupted mid-motion, slippers removed, a television still glowing, a man simply settled in for the evening, the next case pulls us back more than 2 centuries, to the very first formally recorded instance of this same impossible pattern, in the household of an Italian countess, whose death would go on to shape how an entire scientific debate has been argued ever since. On the night of March 14th, 1731, in the papal city of Cesena, in what is now northern Italy, a noble woman named Countess Cornelia Zangari Bandi sat down to supper, feeling unusually dull and heavy, a vague, uncharacteristic tiredness that none of her household seems to have thought much of at the time. She was 62 years old, a widow of considerable standing in Cesena society, mother to several grown children, one of whom would go on to become a cardinal of the Catholic Church, and grandmother, through another branch of the family, to a boy who would eventually be elected pope. That night, after supper, she retired to her bedroom as usual and spent nearly 3 hours talking quietly with her maid before finally saying her prayers and settling into sleep. The maid shut the door behind her and left the countess for the night, exactly as she had done countless times before. What that maid found the following morning would go on to become the single most influential case in the entire history of what we now call spontaneous human combustion, the first incident of its kind to be formally investigated, scientifically documented, and published in the record of a major scientific society, and the case every serious researcher on either side of this debate still traces the phenomenon's origin back to, nearly 300 years later, regardless of whether they ultimately believe it represents something genuinely unexplained or simply the earliest well-documented example of an otherwise ordinary, if severe, fire. When the countess failed to rise at her usual hour, her maid returned to check on her, calling out and receiving no answer. She opened the window to let in the morning light, and what that light revealed, roughly 4 feet from the bed itself, was almost impossible to process at first glance. Where the countess should have been, there was instead a circle of fine ash and greasy soot. 2 legs remained, still clothed in their stockings, intact from roughly the knee downward. 3 blackened fingers lay nearby, and on the floor between the ruined legs sat a large, calcined fragment of the countess's own skull, missing its back, its chin, and, investigators would later note explicitly, its brain, apparently consumed entirely, along with the rest of her head. A thick, foul-smelling yellowish residue coated the walls and ceiling of the room, a film so persistent that household staff reportedly found it could not be fully scrubbed away afterward. Remarkably, the bedding itself told its own separate story. The blankets and sheets had been thrown back, tossed aside in the specific way a person's bedding looks when they've simply gotten up and out of it on their own. Not burned, not disturbed by any struggle, but pushed aside the way anyone might push aside their covers to rise for the night, whether to use a chamber pot or simply because they'd woken feeling unwell. A small oil lamp sitting in the room was found afterward completely empty of fuel, yet entirely unbroken and undamaged by any fire, a detail that would occupy a considerable amount of the investigation that followed, since an empty, intact lamp is exactly what you'd expect to find if its oil had simply burned down naturally over the course of an ordinary night, rather than exploding or shattering violently as part of whatever had actually destroyed the countess herself. And investigators at the time took real care to rule out the lamp as a direct physical cause before considering any alternative explanation. Word of the countess's death spread quickly through Cesena and beyond, and the case was soon brought to the attention of Giuseppe Bianchini, a respected clergyman, scholar, and canon from Verona, who would go on to serve as a scientific advisor to 2 separate popes over the course of his career. Bianchini traveled to examine the scene directly, and the report he ultimately produced, a formal written opinion addressed to a fellow count, titled, in translation, Opinion on the Cause of the Death of the Lady Countess Cornelia Zangari of the Bandi family of Cesena, became one of the most widely circulated and seriously considered scientific documents of its era, read and debated by physicians, historians, and natural philosophers across Europe in the years that followed. Bianchini approached the case with real methodological rigor for his time, deliberately working through and ruling out each of the obvious, mundane explanations available to him before proposing his own, an approach that stands out precisely because so many earlier or lesser accounts of similarly strange deaths were simply attributed to divine punishment, witchcraft, or demonic possession without any real attempt at physical investigation at all. He considered whether the small oil lamp, or perhaps a stray candle, might simply have ignited the countess's bedding or nightclothes and spread from there. He rejected that explanation directly, reasoning, in his own words, that ordinary fire, even a substantial house fire, does not consume a body to such a degree without also spreading to and destroying the far more flammable furnishings surrounding it, and the room's furniture, curtains, and bedding had, notably, survived largely intact. He considered whether a lightning strike might have entered through a window or chimney crack and struck her directly, a genuinely reasonable hypothesis for the era, given how poorly understood electrical phenomena still were in 1731. He rejected that explanation too, pointing out the complete absence of the physical signs a lightning strike would normally leave behind, no scorch marks on the walls, no acrid electrical smell reported by anyone who entered the room afterward. Nothing consistent with an external electrical event of that magnitude. Having ruled out both of the obvious mundane explanations available to him, Bianchini proposed something else entirely. That the fire had originated from within the Countess's own body, rather than from any external source at all. He reasoned that she had, for some time before her death, suffered from an excess of internal heat, concentrated specifically in her chest. A heat he believed had prevented her from sweating normally, and had contributed directly to the dull and heavy feeling she'd reportedly described at supper the night she died. That internal heat, he proposed, had somehow reached a point of spontaneous ignition, consuming her body from the torso outward and upward, consistent, he argued, with the specific pattern of destruction found at the scene, where her legs below the knee had survived largely undamaged, while everything above had been almost completely destroyed. Bianchini went further still, identifying what he believed was a specific contributing factor. The Countess, it was reported, had a regular habit of bathing or rubbing her skin with a camphorated spirit of wine, an alcohol-based remedy commonly used at the time to treat minor ailments and general malaise, which she had reportedly been using again on the very evening of her death, given how unwell she'd been feeling. Bianchini's reasoning proposed that a body sufficiently saturated with alcohol, whether through this kind of regular topical application or through drinking, might become significantly more flammable than an ordinary body, providing exactly the kind of fuel his internal heat theory required in order to actually ignite and sustain a fire severe enough to produce the destruction found in her bedroom. The case did not stay confined to Cesena, or even to Italy. In 1744, Bianchini's report was translated into English by Paul Rolli, an Italian poet living in London, who also held the distinction of being a Fellow of the Royal Society, and published in the Society's Philosophical Transactions, placing the Countess's death formally into the scientific record of one of the most prestigious learned institutions in Europe. It was this 1744 translation that effectively coined the phrase used to describe the phenomenon ever since: spontaneous human combustion. From there, the case rippled outward through the intellectual circles of the era, drawing serious engagement and commentary from major figures of the period, including the Italian scholars Scipione Maffei and Ludovico Antonio Muratori, both prominent voices in Enlightenment-era natural philosophy, and, according to later scholarship tracing the case's influence, even Immanuel Kant, who reportedly engaged with the phenomenon as part of broader philosophical debates concerning the natural limits of physical explanation. That such a specifically local provincial death in a mid-sized papal city could travel far enough to reach some of the most significant philosophical minds of the entire Enlightenment says something about how genuinely unresolved the underlying physical question already felt to educated observers of the era. This wasn't dismissed as peasant superstition or explained away quickly by the era's leading thinkers, but treated as a real, if deeply uncomfortable, gap in contemporary natural philosophy's ability to explain the physical world. Nearly a century later, the Italian poet and philosopher Giacomo Leopardi also engaged with the case as part of his own broader writing on unexplained natural phenomena, treating it as a genuine curiosity of the natural world rather than dismissing it outright, a reflection of just how durable the case's reputation as a serious, unresolved question remained across successive generations of European intellectual life, well beyond the immediate scientific circles that had first debated it in the 1740s. More than a century later, the case found its way into English literature by a considerably more famous route. Charles Dickens, in the preface to his 1853 novel Bleak House, defended his decision to kill off one of the novel's characters, Crook, a heavy-drinking rag-and-bottle dealer, through spontaneous combustion, leaving behind nothing but a small pile of ash and a charred fragment resembling burnt wood. Dickens cited the Countess's case directly as part of his defense, having, by his own account, read extensively on the subject and become genuinely convinced of its scientific legitimacy. His depiction drew immediate criticism from at least one prominent scientific voice of the era, who argued publicly that the entire premise violated basic, well-established principles of combustion and simply could not occur the way Dickens had described it. Dickens defended his portrayal vigorously in later editions of the novel, standing by the historical case reports he'd relied on, including the Countess's, as sufficient grounds for what he'd written. Modern researchers examining the Bandy case today, working from a case file that is now very nearly 3 centuries old, are left with roughly the same divide Bianchini himself first identified, translated now into modern forensic language rather than 18th century natural philosophy. The Wick effect theory that would eventually be used to explain Mary Reese's death in 1951 and Henry Thomas's in 1980 applies here with at least some plausibility. An elderly woman, alone, likely using an alcohol-based liniment on her skin that night, near an open flame source in the form of her own oil lamp, could theoretically have provided both an ignition source and the necessary fuel, her own rendered body fat, drawn upward through her nightclothes acting as a wick, to produce a slow, self-contained, catastrophic burn while leaving the rest of the room comparatively undamaged. Skeptical researchers examining the case in more recent decades have generally favored some version of this explanation, while proponents arguing for a genuinely distinct, unexplained phenomenon, including researchers who have spent entire careers cataloging cases like this one, continue to point out the same objection that has followed the Wick effect since it was first proposed. The sheer speed and totality of destruction described in the Bandy case, by every contemporary account, appears to have occurred within a single night, likely within just a few hours, which sits uneasily alongside a mechanism generally understood to require a slow, sustained burn lasting considerably longer to achieve anything close to the same result. What makes the Countess's case so foundational, sitting at the very start of this entire investigation into unexplained combustion, is precisely that it was never allowed to remain a piece of local folklore or an unverified rumor passed down second-hand. It was examined directly by a genuinely credentialed scholar of the era, using the best available reasoning and evidence of his time, and then formally entered into the permanent scientific record of one of the world's oldest and most respected scientific institutions, where it has remained, cited, debated, and never fully resolved for very nearly 300 years. Larry Arnold, an American researcher who spent decades cataloging cases resembling the Countess's and arguing for a genuinely distinct combustive phenomenon, has pointed specifically to cases like hers as evidence against the Wick effect being a complete explanation on its own. His argument centers on timing. Household staff, by every contemporary account, had no reason to suspect anything was wrong until the following morning, meaning the fire that destroyed the countess's body most likely occurred within a single uninterrupted stretch of night, probably a matter of hours, not the extended multi-hour or longer burn that a genuine wick effect fire, progressing gradually as fat renders and travels upward through fabric, would generally be expected to require in order to produce anything close to the totality of destruction found in her bedroom. If Arnold's timeline is correct, whatever process destroyed the countess would have needed to work considerably faster than the mechanism proposed to explain it. A gap that, in his view, and in the view of researchers who share his skepticism of the wick effect as a complete answer, has never been adequately closed by conventional fire science, even 3 centuries later. Skeptics of Arnold's position, in turn, point out that no one was actually present to time the fire as it happened, and that the household's own assumption that nothing seemed wrong until morning doesn't necessarily mean the fire itself began late in the night, rather than starting shortly after the countess fell asleep and simply burning, slowly and quietly, for several hours behind a closed bedroom door. In a fairly substantial noble residence with thick walls and doors built for genuine privacy, without producing enough smoke or smell to wake anyone in an adjoining room, without a witness present for any part of the actual burning, both timelines remain plausible, and neither can be definitively ruled out using the evidence that survives from 1731. That same gluish, yellowish residue found coating the walls and ceiling, described in Bianchini's own report as resistant even to vigorous scrubbing by the household staff afterward, closely mirrors the fine, greasy mist investigators would later document in Henry Thomas's living room in 1980, and the fat, saturated carpet found beneath Mary Reese's chair in 1951. It's one of the more striking through lines connecting cases separated by more than 2 centuries and an ocean. Whatever mechanism is actually at work, it appears to consistently distribute a portion of the body's own rendered fat across the surrounding room in a fine aerosolized layer, rather than simply leaving it pooled beneath the remains the way a slower, more localized fire might be expected to. The Countess's case also illustrates something that recurs across nearly every well-documented incident in this category, regardless of era. The specific combination of an elderly victim found alone with an available ignition source nearby and some plausible internal or topical accelerant already present in or on the body beforehand. In the Countess's case, that meant her age, her solitude that night, the oil lamp in her room, and her own reported habit of using alcohol-based liniments. 300 years later, the exact details change from case to case. A cigarette instead of an oil lamp, a modern armchair instead of a canopied bed, but the underlying pattern and the underlying scientific disagreement about whether that pattern fully explains what happened has proven remarkably durable across every century since. If Countess Bandy's case gives us the very first formally documented instance of this pattern, a body destroyed far beyond what its surroundings would suggest, examined and debated by the sharpest minds available at the time, the final case tonight breaks the pattern in an entirely different direction. No fire investigator, no chair, no single body reduced to ash in a single room. Instead, 5 men, a broken down car, and a frozen mountain range where all five would eventually be found, scattered, in a physical condition that medical examiners still can't fully explain to this day. On the evening of Friday, February 24th, 1978, 5 men from Yuba City, California, climbed into a blue 1969 Mercury Montego and drove north to Chico, about 55 miles away, to watch a college basketball game between UC Davis and the Chico State Wildcats. The men, Jack Madruga, 30, who owned the car, Ted Waher, 32, Bill Sterling, 29, Jackie Hewitt, 24, and Gary Mathias, 25, were friends, all connected through a local social organization that helped adults with intellectual disabilities and psychiatric conditions build community and friendship with one another. Wire, by most accounts, was something of a gentle giant among the group, a large, easygoing man well liked by everyone who knew him. Sterling was active in several local churches and had reportedly spent time reading scripture to patients in mental health facilities, and was involved in a local group organizing social events for single adults in the area. They picked Hewitt up last, around 6 that evening, and made the drive north together, arriving in time for tip-off. It was, by every account gathered afterward, an entirely ordinary night out for 5 men who did this kind of thing together fairly regularly. They were seen at the game. They were seen afterward at a nearby convenience store, where Waher and Hewitt bought burritos, chocolate milk, and soft drinks for the group before heading back to the car. And then, sometime after that, on a straightforward, roughly hour-long drive home, down Highway 70, through California's flat, low-lying Central Valley, a route with no snow, no mountain grades, nothing remotely difficult about it even in February. The 5 men simply never arrived. 4 days later, on February 28th, Madruga's Mercury Montego was found abandoned on a remote, snow-covered dirt road deep in Plumas National Forest, roughly 70 miles in the opposite direction from where the men should have been heading, up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, thousands of feet above the snow line, and well beyond any route a reasonable navigational error could easily account for. The car was sitting in shallow snowpack, not badly stuck, and investigators determined it had been in good working order the entire time. Enough gas in the tank, no mechanical failure, nothing that would have forced the men to abandon it. By all accounts, it likely could have been pushed free of the snow it was resting in, with only moderate effort. The doors were unlocked. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no indication that anything violent had happened inside or immediately around the vehicle. It looked, in the most unsettling way possible, like 5 men had simply parked it there and walked away, deliberately, calmly, into a snowy forest at night, dressed in nothing more than the light jackets, dress shoes, and ordinary clothing they'd worn to a basketball game. Investigators were never able to construct any plausible explanation for how the group ended up on that road in the first place. It wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't on any known or logical route between Chico and Yuba City. It required a wrong turn so significant and sustained for so long without correction that multiple investigators over the years have struggled to accept it as simple, ordinary human error. 5 men, all of whom knew the area reasonably well, driving that far into unfamiliar, increasingly snow-covered mountain terrain without turning back at any point along the way, and without, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, a single logical reason to have started down that road at all. There was one more piece of the puzzle gathered that same night, from a man named Joseph Shons, who had driven up to a cabin he owned in the area to check on snow conditions ahead of a family ski trip, and had gotten his own car stuck in the snow not far from where the Montego would later be found. Shons began experiencing chest pain while trying to free his vehicle. He would later be diagnosed with a mild heart attack, and while stranded there that night, he reported seeing headlights pull up behind him and what looked like several people getting out of a vehicle, including, he believed, someone who appeared to be a woman carrying a baby. He called out for help. The lights went dark, and the group, whoever or whatever they were, went silent. About 2 hours later, he reported seeing flashlight beams nearby and called out again, and again. The lights went out and nothing more happened. By morning, his own car had run out of fuel, and he walked roughly 8 miles down the mountain to reach help, passing directly by the now empty Montego along the way, not yet knowing it belonged to anyone significant. Investigators were never able to confirm that a woman and child had genuinely been present on that mountain road that night, and Shons himself, in the years since, has been treated by researchers examining the case with real uncertainty. A man in genuine medical distress, in the cold and dark, whose account may have been entirely accurate, partially accurate, or shaped by the effects of hypothermia and cardiac strain on his perception. No corroborating witness or piece of physical evidence has ever definitively confirmed a woman and infant were anywhere near that road. Whatever Shons did or didn't see, it has never been folded cleanly into any confirmed version of what actually happened to the 5 missing men. An extensive ground search was launched immediately, but deep snowpack across the entire region made the effort largely futile. No trace of the men was found. As winter dragged on and search efforts were gradually scaled back, the case remained entirely unresolved for months. Then, on June 4th, 1978, more than 3 months after the men had disappeared, a group of motorcyclists riding through Plumas National Forest, now clear of snow, came across a small United States Forest Service maintenance trailer, roughly 20 miles from where Madruga's car had been found, and reported an unmistakable, overwhelming smell coming from inside. What searchers found inside that trailer would become the single most haunting detail in the entire case. Ted Waher's body lay on a bed, wrapped almost completely in 8 separate sheets and blankets, including one drawn up over his head, an arrangement that strongly suggested someone else had been present to cover him, whether shortly before or after his death, since it's difficult to reconstruct a scenario where a man in his final, weakened state could have arranged that much bedding over himself so completely and so deliberately, layer after layer, tucked in a way searchers described as looking deliberate, rather than the result of someone simply pulling a single blanket over themselves before losing consciousness. Wyatt had weighed roughly 200 pounds at the time he disappeared. At the time he was found, he weighed approximately 120, a loss of nearly half his entire body weight. The length of his beard growth, combined with the severity of his weight loss, led investigators to conclude he had very likely survived for somewhere between 8 and 13 weeks inside that trailer, potentially into May, before finally dying of a combination of starvation and hypothermia. His feet showed frostbite severe enough to have caused gangrene, and he had lost several toes entirely. His leather shoes were missing from his body. What made this even harder to reconcile was the trailer's contents. It held a genuine, if modest, supply of emergency rations and heating materials, exactly the kind of stockpile Forest Service maintenance trailers in remote areas are equipped with for precisely this sort of emergency. Some of that food had clearly been eaten, much of it had not. A man who had, by every physical indication, been slowly starving to death over a period of months had apparently not consumed everything available to him, for reasons no investigator has ever been able to definitively establish. A partially melted candle, his wallet still containing cash, and a gold necklace and ring he habitually wore were all found undisturbed on a table beside the bed, suggesting no struggle, no panic, nothing resembling a chaotic final scene. Investigators searching the surrounding area over the following days recovered the remains of Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt, scattered separately across the forest between the abandoned car and the trailer, roughly 20 miles apart, a substantial distance to cover on foot, through what would have been extremely deep snow at the time of their disappearance, in ordinary shoes and light clothing, entirely unsuited to that terrain or that cold, and in a direction that took them, inexplicably, further from any road or town rather than back toward one. Months of exposure and animal scavenging had reduced their remains to skeletal fragments, making it impossible for medical examiners to determine an exact cause of death for any of the three beyond a general finding consistent with exposure to the elements. No gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no blunt force trauma detectable in what remained, nothing indicating a physical attack, if one had occurred, severe enough to leave lasting skeletal evidence months later. Roughly a quarter-mile from the trailer, searchers also found 3 Forest Service wool blankets and a slightly rusted 2-cell flashlight lying beside the road, switched off. Investigators had no way of determining how long any of it had been sitting there, or by whom it had been left. Inside the trailer itself, alongside Wayher's body, investigators found a separate pair of shoes, not Wayher's own missing leather ones, but a pair belonging to Gary Mathias, the 5th man, still unaccounted for. The working theory that's emerged from that single detail is that Mathias may have survived alongside Wayher inside that trailer for some period, and that at some point, his own feet swelling from frostbite, he may have taken Wayher's larger shoes in order to attempt to walk for help himself, leaving his own smaller pair behind. If that's what happened, it would mean Mathias, alone, in Wayher's ill-fitting shoes, set out on foot from that trailer into the wilderness, and simply vanished. No trace of Gary Mathias has ever been found, not in that summer's search, and not in the nearly 5 decades since. Investigators have never settled on a single explanation for how 5 capable adult men, none of them unfamiliar with the general region, ended up walking away from a functioning fueled vehicle into a snowbound forest at night, dressed for a basketball game rather than a mountain expedition. Some have proposed that something at the game itself, or in the parking lot afterward, frightened or unsettled the group badly enough to explain their panicked, wrong direction drive, a theory relatives of the men have publicly supported over the decades, insisting the group would never have willingly wandered off into the woods on their own. Jack Madruga's mother, Mabel, was among the most vocal in pressing this view for years afterward. There was some force that made them go up there, she told reporters. They wouldn't have fled off in the woods like a bunch of quail. We know good and well that somebody made them do it. We can't visualize someone getting the upper hand on those 5 men, but we know it must have been. A California Department of Justice special agent who joined the investigation described the sheer volume and inconsistency of leads the case generated in its early months in similarly bewildered terms. Bizarre and no explanations, and 1,000 leads. Every day, you've got 1,000 leads. Others have focused on the psychiatric and cognitive conditions several of the men lived with, wondering whether a moment of confusion, disorientation, or a missed medication dose among the group might help explain both the wrong turn and the group's decision to leave the car on foot, once stuck, rather than staying with the vehicle, as standard cold weather survival advice would generally recommend. Gary Mathias, in particular, is known to have been prescribed medication for a diagnosed psychiatric condition, and family members have since raised the possibility that he may have gone without it for some period leading up to or during the disappearance, though no one has ever been able to establish this with certainty or connect it directly to the group's specific decisions that night. Neither explanation, outside interference, or an internal medical or psychological crisis within the group itself, has ever been proven, and both remain, like nearly everything else about this case, genuinely unresolved theories rather than settled conclusions. The case has since drawn comparisons to the Dyatlov Pass incident in the Soviet Ural Mountains nearly 2 decades earlier. Another group of capable, experienced outdoors people who, for reasons never conclusively established, abandoned the relative safety of their shelter in freezing conditions and were later found scattered, some partially dressed, some with unexplained injuries, across the surrounding terrain. The comparison isn't perfect. The Yuba County men weren't experienced mountaineers, and their fatal error began with a drive rather than a deliberate wilderness expedition. But the underlying pattern researchers keep returning to is strikingly similar in both cases. A group that should have stayed together and stayed put, choosing instead, for reasons never recovered, to scatter into conditions that would very likely kill them, and in most cases did. Author Tony Wright, who spent 4 years researching the case for a book on the disappearance, has been candid about just how little the available evidence actually supports any single confident theory. "We lack concrete evidence," he said. "Mostly it's circumstantial stuff. Town talk, rumors. This case is a journey into madness. It's a fitting way to describe an investigation that, 47 years on, still has considerably more theories in circulation than confirmed facts to support any one of them." One of Wayher's own family members, his sister-in-law, later offered her own theory, rooted in something she believed the men might have witnessed, rather than any medical or psychological explanation. "They seen something at that game, at the parking lot," she said. They might have seen it, and didn't even realize they seen it, a suggestion that whatever set the group on its fatal wrong turn may have begun the moment they left the arena, hours before anyone else would have thought to look for them. 47 years later, the disappearance of the Yuba County Five remains an active, if largely dormant, case file with California investigators, periodically revisited as new forensic and investigative techniques become available, in the hope that something, a fragment of remains belonging to Gary Mathias, a piece of physical evidence overlooked in 1978, a witness account that never surfaced, might eventually close the one gap that has never been filled. what actually happened on that road, and where the fifth man's journey through the snow finally ended. 6 deaths tonight, across nearly 3 centuries, from a bedroom in Papal Italy to a hospital in Riverside, California, from a derelict house in London to a council estate in Wales, from a Florida apartment to a snowbound forest in the Sierra Nevada. Different eras, different investigators, different tools entirely. And in every single case, the same basic shape, a body, examined thoroughly by people whose entire profession is built around finding answers that simply didn't behave the way bodies are supposed to behave, burning too fast, too completely, too selectively, or, in tonight's final case, walking calmly away from safety into conditions that should have turned everyone back within minutes. That's the thread running underneath everything you heard tonight. Not that these 6 deaths are impossible. Every one of them happened to a real person, examined by real professionals, using the best tools available in their era. It's that each of them sits in a strange, uncomfortable space between explained and understood, a working theory that accounts for most of the evidence, and a small, stubborn remainder that never quite fits. Sometimes that remainder is a single, unproven chemical reaction. Sometimes it's a fire that moved faster than physics says it should have. And sometimes, like tonight's final case, it's simply a question with no theory attached to it at all. 5 men, a working car, and a decision none of them lived long enough to explain.